what would you assume is the most major threat on the world stage? Anybody, just call it out. You don't have to raise your hand.
Definitely Russia.
Definitely Russia. That's confident. I like it. Who says Russia? Anybody agree with her? Hands? Okay, great. Who else? China. Stop yelling at me, but China is a good answer. Anybody? Venezuela? Anybody? No? Oh, yeah. One guy in the back. A little worried about Venezuela. Everybody's cool with Venezuela? No threat? Okay. Let me ask you this. Which one of these places can claim to have the largest oil deposit on the planet? More than Saudi? More than Iran? Wow. Okay, what about things like gold? More than all the mines in Africa combined? The fact is that Venezuela is arguably the single greatest resource of oil and minerals on the planet. So, why is this country in the midst of one of the greatest humanitarian crises in modern history? Let's meet President Nicolas Reyes. After rising to power on a wave of nationalist pride, in a mere 6 years, this guy has crippled the national economy by half. He has raised the poverty rate by almost 400%. Luckily for the rest of us, he's up for re-election. So, who's running against him? This is Gloria Bonalde. Now, Gloria is a history professor turned activist. She's running against him on a social justice platform and on the strength of, in my humble opinion, just not being an Analyst predictions, as of today, have the chances of Venezuela's total economic collapse at 87%. On the news, they'll call it a crisis. But on the world stage, they'll call it a failed state. If you've never heard that term, other examples of a failed state in recent history are Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. And if that's not bad enough news for you, well, Venezuela is also the only one of these places within 30-minute range from the U.S. with next-gen nuclear missiles. You will not hear about any of this on the news because the biggest players on the world stage do not want you to. To them, unstable governments are nothing more than the greatest of opportunities. So, Russia, China, can never be the most major threat until countries like Venezuela leave the door open to our very own backyard.
We are only a few days into this and already things are moving way faster than anyone could ever have predicted. Reports of explosions inside Venezuela, US military activity still escalating. And now the President of the United States is publicly claiming that Venezuela's president is sitting in the room next door to him. Well, maybe not that hyperbolic, but you get the gist. That alone should stop all of us for a huge pause, for at least a second. Because whenever or wherever something big like this happens, this quickly, the explanation you're given first is almost never the fullest one. We're being told that this is about criminal networks. We're being told it's about narco-terrorism. And if you scratch just a little bit between or below the surface, you'll hear another familiar explanation, which is the three-letter word, oil. But even that might not be the actual real story. So the real question is this: why now? Why Venezuela? And what does anything of all of this have to do with inflation, markets, and the cost of living that regular people are now struggling with? Because according to official statements, this operation followed US strikes on Venezuelan maritime assets and warning that ground action was actually coming. So this wasn't, like most people have thought, actually spontaneous.
Last night, on the order of the President of the United States, and in support of a request from the Department of Justice, the United States military conducted an apprehension mission in Caracas, Venezuela, to bring to justice two indicted persons, Nicolas and Cecilia Maduro.
Nicolas Maduro had his chance until he didn't. He effed around and he found out.
This was one of the most stunning, effective and powerful displays of American military might and competence in American history.
I don't understand yet how they haven't figured this out. And now, if you don't know, now you know. Because this is the way it's going to play out. And I think people need to understand that this is not a president that just talks and does letters and press conferences. And, you know, if he says he's serious about something, he means it. But don't play games. Don't play games with this president's in office, because it's not going to turn out well.
It was telegraphed, it was openly spoken about, and you could see the military build-up in the region. And markets probably didn't price it in, let's be honest. Because at the same time, US officials announced criminal indictments against Venezuela's leadership, framing the move as a law enforcement activity rather than like a geopolitical one. Because that framing actually matters, because it gives a legitimate cover. But it's impossible to talk about Venezuela without talking about the one thing the country has more than anywhere else almost on all of Earth. And that's that three-letter inconvenient word again, oil. And it's not just a lot of oil. It's the largest proven oil reserve in the entire world. And long before any of this happened, President Trump had already been talking really publicly about Venezuela in a very, very specific way. Not as a humanitarian issue, but as a strategic loss. Because he said repeatedly, if you've been listening, that US companies were pushed out, that oil access was lost, and that resources that once flowed toward American interests were allowed to slip away out of their grasp and out of the grasp of corporations in America. And now, suddenly, what's happening? The US is very much involved all again. Now, that's not really subtle. Senior officials have been even more explicit in their warnings. You've had statements about recovering stolen resources, comments about American companies returning, and repeated signals that Venezuela's energy sector will be restructured with heavy US intervention and production. So that alone should tell us that it's not just about the crime and the indictments that they're telling us about. There's another part of the timeline that hasn't got nearly enough attention. Because late last night, Chinese officials reportedly arrived in Venezuela for high-level talks. Hours later, US strikes began. That timing raises an uncomfortable question. Was this actually about Venezuela, or was it about someone else getting the influence first, preventing someone like China from locking in that influence first and getting those strategic assets? Because China has been steadily expanding its footprint across Latin America for years and years. Infrastructure deals, energy partnerships, resource agreements. And Venezuela sits at the intersection of all of that. Oil, geography, and leverage over the Western Hemisphere is where the energy is flowing towards. From Washington's perspective, that's actually a huge red line. Zoom out even further, even more strategically, and this starts to look a lot less like a single operation and more like a global pressure point, a global pressure map, because China is pushing forward. The US is pushing back, obviously, and both sides are positioning around energy, around supply chains and control of strategic assets, assets that are needed for the AI revolution. We've already seen this dynamic happen in Asia. Taiwan isn't just a political issue, it's a manufacturing choke point. TSMC, semiconductors, advanced transistors, AI infrastructure, military systems. Because remember, if you control the inputs, then you actually control the future. And oil plays the exact same role for energy. And energy still underpins absolutely everything, including inflation. Now, here's where it hits our pockets. Here's where it hits home. When geopolitical tension spikes, markets usually react in two phases. First is always fear, risk-off behavior. Consumers, they pull back, they tighten their purse strings. Businesses start to hesitate. Credit obviously tightens. That phase almost always in history looks deflationary at first, but it rarely lasts, because the second phase is where governments step in, defense spending rises, emergency programs start to expand, stimulus starts to be issued, deficits start to grow, supply chains always start to fracture. It's slow at first, but when the demand is supported by the government, spending while supply gets disrupted, prices don't end up falling. They always inevitably end up rising. Now, that's not a theory, that is just history and it's mathematical reality. We've seen it before. We saw it after 2001, we saw it after 2020, and we may be seeing it right now, at least the early stages of it happening again. All of this is happening while a few other things happen to normal, ordinary folks in the economy. Consumer sentiment is hitting historic lows, is sitting down there languishing. Inflation is still eating away at your paycheck and at your wages and at your purchasing power. And unemployment is quietly, silently ticking down all the while. And central banks are already trapped after years of money printing, QE and bailouts. And that's the part that leaders, our politicians, rarely ever talk about. Because From top down, this all looks strategic, but from the bottom up, it looks like pressure. It feels like pressure. Higher prices, less stability, higher unemployment, lower consumer sentiment, higher CPI, more uncertainty, more job insecurity, more rental anxiety, more loan pressure, more delinquencies. And the people making these decisions, they're always insulated from all of it. So I want to actually be clear here. I don't ever have perfect information. No one does. I could be wrong. Maybe I am. This could evolve in a way that no one, absolutely no one, expects it to evolve. And my thoughts are first and foremost with the civilians of Venezuela who are caught in the middle of the events that they never got to choose, because the people never get to choose those events that they succumb to. But if history teaches us anything, it's this. Big geopolitical moves rarely happen in isolation. They are almost always tied back to money, energy, and power. And they almost always show up later on in inflation. In inflation data, in rental prices, in markets, in the grocery shops, and in everyday life. So the real question here isn't what happens in Venezuela next. It's what kind of economic environment is waiting for us around the corner and what this pushes us into globally. So let me know what you think I've missed, or if I'm underestimating or reading the situation completely incorrectly, or if you just think I'm playing wrong and this is actually great news for the economy. Because I'm here to talk about money, I'm here to talk about liquidity, markets, and the forces behind them, even when things get uncomfortable for all of us. And as always, none of this is financial advice. I'm just a guy trying to make sense of a complicated world in real time. So your support is needed and your support is appreciated. Until next time, stay safe out there, guys.